Welcome, everyone, to the second in our series on asking questions and defining problems. We are going through the different SEPs and helping to provide some guidance on questioning strategies and also resources that you can use to drive student engagement in your classrooms or in your schools or in your districts. So we're really, really excited to be here and to be talking about that. For introductions, I'm happy to introduce myself. Hello, my name is Brendan Finch. My pronouns are he, him. I taught middle and high school, and I left the classroom 10 years ago to build rocketlit.com. That is our leveled reading website. And we also started InnerOrbit about 6 years ago. And I wrote all of the assessments on InnerOrbit to start with. And I'm working right now with teachers and administrators and Kate and many other amazing members of our team to build out other ways to support admin and students. And kind of some of the stuff that we're talking about today is like some of the stuff that we're researching. I'm really, really excited. So I have this absolute behemoth jar that's filled with honey and like milky tea. And I really, really like this. This is like a winter thing for me where it doesn't even need to be caffeinated, but just having a source of heat and like hydration is really satisfying to me. And maybe some of you think that tea tastes like dirty water, but I like it. And with that, I'll pass it to Kate.
Thank you, Brendan. I'm just giggling because I'm sitting here in Detroit where it is 19 degrees listening to Brendan in California talking about how he needs warm tea. So, I actually love tea too. But my name is Kate Stevens. My pronouns are she, hers. I was a middle and high school science teacher, department lead, and instructional coach for actually a little bit more than 14 years. I am currently the NGSS content manager for InnerOrbit, and I am a total science geek and lifelong explorer of the natural world. I'm passionate about improving science content and resources to make them accessible to all students and teachers, which is something that Brendan was talking about. Do better than Brendan, but we should all do better than we did yesterday, tomorrow. So that's what I'm hoping to continue doing. I hope to never be done learning and growing in that respect. And since Brendan made his fun fact about milk, I decided that I would too. And that is my strong claim that oat milk is better in a latte than any other kind of milk, even though I drink all kinds. So, with that unimportant fact about myself, let's get into science and engineering practices.
Yay. Okay. All right. I'm not going to comment on oat milk. I enjoy some oat milk, but you know what I enjoy even more than oat milk? It's actually InnerOrbit. And I want to explain what it is if you don't know what InnerOrbit is really, really quickly. So on InnerOrbit, it's a website. And on that website, you're going to find a couple of different things. One are phenomena. And those phenomena are actual real life examples of things that happen in the real world that students can explain with their science knowledge. So students log in InnerOrbit, the teachers and districts will build assessments for students to transfer the knowledge from whatever they learned in class, whatever phenomena that was involved in, and something brand new. And then we write all of these really scaffolded, really, really discrete questions to tell accurate stories about students. We're going to talk about some stories later on today and talk about maybe some things that you can do with that. But those stories are told right now through the language of data. And so you can go into our reports and you can dig into not just like a performance expectation, like students did well on this performance expectation, but a really discrete element, which those are like sub parts to an SEP. So developing using models, one of the elements we see in this report, students struggled to develop a model to describe unobservable mechanisms. So really, really discrete part of that standard. If you're curious about checking out InnerOrbit and you would like to do those things, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop links to our calendars in the chat. Please, 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 if you're looking for help with getting started with this, you're welcome to click on one of those links and chat with us. We also do a lot of professional learning. You right now are involved in one of those events. Congratulations. These are things where we are looking to help folks to understand the NGSS. And through that lens, we'll either come into your districts, your classrooms, or virtually we will visit through a rectangular shaped object like the ones that you're listening to us on right now. And we'll talk to you about the NGSS and through the lens of assessments, help to clarify what sense making is, what the NGSS is, and then maybe how we can respond to data, which is one of the things that we're going to talk about today. Speaking of what we're going to talk about today, this webinar is part two of our webinar series on asking questions and defining problems. If you were present for the last webinar, that's fantastic. If not, it will be posted on YouTube as well, and we will link that webinar in the description of this video. Our objective in this webinar was to build upon the introduction and start to explore strategies and resources for scaffolding the SEP, asking questions and defining problems. Interestingly enough, this was voted on at our last scaffolding webinar as the #1 SEP that folks wanted to explore. And guess what? At the end of this webinar, you're going to get to vote again because that's really exciting. We're going to be here for about an hour. And in that time, we're going to talk about sense making a little bit, what sense making is. And then we're going to talk about SEP grade level bands. So it's important when we talk about scaffolding to also figure out, are we hitting the right level of rigor? So grade level bands and progressions, we'll talk about the SEP practice problems a little bit. We'll also look at 3D questions. And then we're going to dig into some different questioning strategies on InnerOrbit. We want to give you some resources, some tools, some ways to think about this. So we'll talk about SEP practice problems, we'll talk about 2-dimensional questions, and then 3-dimensional questions. And then new in this session, we're going to talk about responding to SEP data. What are things that you could do if you wanted to respond to SEP data? That means you gave students an assessment, and you were like, ruh-roh, or yay, they did well on the SEP. How can we either lean into their success or like help to raise them up? And then finally, Kate is going to go over scaffolding science practices with students, which we're really, really excited about because she is building out some tools that are really, really interesting for actual students to grapple with phenomena and try to make sense of it through the lens of an SEP, which is fantastic. And they're not questions so much as like a framework. There's a term for this, Kate, that you used. It's, what is it?
Thinking routine.
Thinking routine. I love that. I need more thinking routines. Speaking of thinking routines, let's dive into our first section here, which is on sense making. Sense making is this term that we see thrown about in NGSS literature, and we talk about students have to make sense of things. Recently was at a science conference, and one of the researchers that was presenting talked about it's just figuring it out, and he wanted all of us to say figuring things out, which is great too. But I think figuring things out and making sense of things, maybe this helps you to make sense of what sense making is, which is it's figuring things out. And through the lens of the NGSS, that is done through a phenomena or a problem. And so what's really interesting about this SCP that we're going into today is it talks about asking questions and defining problems, which is not something that we usually focus on in our discussions, which are their scientific questions and their engineering problems that we're focusing on today. So sense making is this idea that we can take our knowledge and our skills and our ways of thinking about the world, and we can bind them together and use those 3 things to make sense of novel phenomena. And the idea with 3-dimensional standards is that we can take our knowledge and our skills and then, like the ways that we think about the world, and we can use those to make sense of new phenomena. So continuously, we can look at new phenomena to do that thing. So one of the things that we talked about in the part 1 of this webinar, I'm going to review really, really quickly here, is that when we're diving into a practice, a science engineering practice, Achieve, who they are the folks who with state partners wrote the NGSS standards, they are looking for these 2 criteria to be met to ensure that students are using that practice for sense making. And those involve both mechanics and skills and a driving purpose. So those 2 facets must be present for students to be accessing sense making. Now, what are mechanics and skills? Well, some examples of that in the lens of asking questions are we asking scientific questions? Are we defining solvable engineering problems? Are we evaluating questions for relevancy? Those are all examples of actual mechanics and skills. But to access these science engineering practices, they also need to have a driving purpose. So some examples of those are designing an investigation or solution, analyzing and interpreting evidence or data, improving a current model or solution. So all of these are, it's not just applying the, like I know things about questions, but it's doing that for a purpose. And you'll notice that each of these different parts of this right here are all about designing an investigation or solution. That's another SEP. And then this one, analyzing, interpreting, hey, look, that's another SEP. And this one, improving a current model, hey, look at that. coincidentally, another SEP. So what you're going to find with this SEP in particular is that there are lots of parallels with asking questions that build upon and improve other SEPs as well. So super, super important to bring that up. If you want to learn more about that, you can check out the initial webinar that we did on the introduction. But now we're going to move on, and we're going to move into the SEP grade level bands. So previously, we would have some activities where folks would explore these. At this point, I think what we want to do is just kind of like communicate a single message, which is that the SEPs develop over time. If you look in the appendices of the NGSS, and this is pulled from the NSTA website, you can look at the SEP complexity of asking questions and defining problems and see that it develops very clearly from a few simple things that we want students to work with in K2 to really complex and really specific processes that we want them to go through in grade levels 9, 12. And these are meant to build over time. So in middle school, they don't need to do all of the things. We want to build upon what they've been doing in previous grade levels. And in high school, we're building upon what they did in middle school. Now, this has implications because later on we're going to talk about, like what if students are struggling at the middle school level? Well, we have some options for that. These can be broken down into very, very discrete threads. So we can look at the thread of asking questions based on observations to find more information about the natural and or design world. That's a K2 element of the standard. And then in high school, we say, ask questions to clarify and refine a model, an explanation, or an engineering problem. So we're clarifying and refining a model really, really specifically. We also have threads from elementary school, like asking questions that can be answered by an investigation to evaluate a question to determine if it is testable and relevant. And so all of these things are developing over time, and there are several different threads that we can see tracing from elementary school or kindergarten all the way into 12th grade. This is about defining simple problems that can be solved through the development of a new or improved object or tool, and then getting into defining a design problem that involves the development of a process or system with interacting components and criteria. And I'm not going to read the entire thing, but it gets really, really specific. There's one element that starts in middle school and then proceeds into high school. And I just want to draw your attention to this as well, because this is not previously covered in any grade levels, which is we're asking questions that challenge the premise of an argument or the interpretation of a data set. So we don't expect students to understand the premises of arguments in elementary school, but from middle and high school, we want to say, but what is that base? What assumptions are you making when you say those things? And those are things that we want students to evaluate as well. Really, really important for science. All right. We talked a little bit about how the SEP builds upon itself from kindergarten to third grade to sixth grade to ninth and 12th grade. And now we want to talk about how we can use different questions to scaffold up to what students are expected to do. This is a very InnerOrbit centric view of this. We are hyper aware of this, and we want to offer a lens that we use to think about questioning strategies so that we can get students up to the point where they are being successful at grade level standards. That's what we want to do. We want to say there's a rigorous, performance we're looking for, the performance expectation, and we want to get them up to that point. And so these are some different ways that we think about how you can scaffold up questioning to access those more advanced skills. So first, we like to ask questions about just the DCI. We want students to represent their knowledge, take what's in your brain, put it out here. Do you know what you need to know? And then we also ask questions about the SCP only. Can you do that thing? Can you, in this case, ask questions, and can you define problems? And that's what we really want you to do. And then we also write questions on InnerOrbit that are two-dimensional. So we want to parse out very specifically the DCI and the SCP together and say, can you ask questions? Can you define problems that involve that DCI? It's really, really important that you keep those things together when you're evaluating students' ability to build into sense making. And so for sense making now, you have the cross-cutting concept, the SCP and the DCI. Previously, we've been neglecting the cross-cutting concept. I want to say, can you pull all these things together and explain a novel phenomena? And that's what we want students to do. That's what sense making is, that explanation of a novel phenomena. And right now, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a standard that is MSPS23. That standard asks students to ask questions about data to determine the factors that affect the strength of electric and magnetic forces. The SCP, of course, because that's the topic of our webinar, is asking questions and defining problems. Students need to understand scientific or types of interactions, that is electric and magnetic, Forces can be attractive or repulsive. There's more in there too. And the cross-cutting concept, which I'm just going to be candid, we're kind of going to ignore during this webinar, is cause and effect. And so we're not going to get too deeply into that. We have other sessions where we talk about cross-cutting concepts. The focus here is the SEP. And so for this SEP, there are several different questions that we can ask students to sort of build up to that, what we want them to get to. And so one of those questions are SEP only questions. And we have questions on the InnerOrbit site that are called SEP practice problems. And one of these SEP practice problem sets is about planning for bike lanes. So someone is working with their city council, they're planning for bike lanes for greater accessibility in their city. And we ask them questions about, a group of students wants to help Marla determine whether cycling is the most practical mode of transportation in their city. Which of these could the students investigate to help Marla gather this data? And so we ask students questions very, very deliberately, leaving out the DCI, leaving out the cross-cutting concept, and just saying, can you do this? Can you ask questions? Can you help to define problems? Can you identify what students can investigate or what students could do to gather this data? So really, really simple questions just about the SCP. This is kind of like the beginning of our scaffold here. And then we also will ask questions about phenomena. We call these DCI only questions. And these questions, they aren't actually about the phenomena. They're really focused on, do you know things that you need to know? And for the standard, it's about types of interactions. Students need to understand that forces are attractive and repulsive. Electric and magnetic forces can be attractive or repulsive. Those are kind of like the two options. And so this question asks students, based on the available evidence in the GIF, what kind of forces are being applied? We want them to be able to identify that there are attractive magnetic forces that are present in this phenomena that we're observing. This only asks about the DCI. We're not getting into cross-cutting concepts or SCPs at all. We're going to build upon whether students have this knowledge into future elements. And so as we kind of like climb our scaffold, then we can ask questions about the DCI and the SCP. These are questions about types of interactions and asking questions. We call these content and practices questions. And these questions will very, very deliberately leave out the cross-cutting concept, but say, now ask questions about those forces and your ability to ask questions and define problems. So this says, which of the following is not a testable question? So testable questions are going to be relevant. There'll be questions we can answer with evidence or data. And so students have to identify which one of these things is a testable question. And all of these things build up to our sense-making questions. And where we want students to arrive at the end of a given unit is we want them to ask questions to make sense of a novel phenomena. These questions will involve the DCI, the SCP, and the cross-cutting concept. So we'll ask them, in this case, which question best represents the variables tested in investigation 2. They're going through and they're identifying a question that represents this whole investigation that is giving. They're identifying a testable question, and they're doing so by thinking about cause and effect, thinking about asking questions and defining problems, and also the types of forces that are present in this interaction. And on InnerOrbit, obviously these multiple choice questions have a lot of value for gathering quick data, but we also include questions that we call sense making that are free response. So this question says, refer to figure 2, choose either investigation 1 or 2 and write a follow-up question that can be asked to better understand the data collected in that investigation. Describe how the question may be answered through an investigation and the type of data that will be collected. This is another three-dimensional question, asking students to take their understanding of the DCI, the SCP, and the cross-cutting concept, and apply all of those things to describe a testable question and explain how that question might be answered through an investigation. Awesome. So let's say we're building an assessment on InnerOrbit, and now we want to figure out what happened and what should we do about that. So through this this is going to be a relatively short section, I want to talk about how you might be able to respond to SCP data. So that phenomena that we're looking at earlier was, how does this blob gobble stuff up? And so this is looking at this really, really discrete phenomena, and it's talking about, obviously magnetic forces, and we have this magnetic goop that is swallowing up this magnet, and we want students to investigate, the forces and ask questions about these things in order to determine, do they understand the premises of this? Are there testable questions? In this case, we do have an investigation that students run through. There's 1, 2, and 3 investigations. The first investigation involves a setup with magnets. They make observations. The second looks at not the number of magnets, but the distance of magnets in relation to the slime. And those are two different investigations they run. One is the number of magnets, and then the second is the distance. And they make observations based on those things. And then there's investigation three that we want students to consider. And so let's just say we went through and used those in-orbit questions. We asked questions about the DCI and the SEP, and maybe even some three-dimensional questions. And this is all relating to this performance expectation, which is MSPS23. Now, let's say in our questioning, we look at the reports on InnerOrbit and we find out that for that DCI, students actually did really well. So 69% is fantastic. If we look at statewide test data and the students are scoring 70% averages, that is really, really great. That's usually going to be proficient. And in some states, that's actually advanced. So fantastic. Students understand the DCI. And now we want to get to, okay, were they able to apply that through the lens of asking questions? And this data that we're looking at here, we're like, oh, shoot. Actually, within asking questions in the 6-8 grade level band, students struggled a little bit with the element here, which is ask questions that can be investigated within the scope of a classroom, outdoor environment, and there's a whole bunch of other a whole bunch of other discrete parts of this, museums and other public facilities, et cetera, et cetera. So students struggle with that. So what are we going to do? This is a problem. And Kate is going to walk through one of the ways that we can deal with this. But on InnerOrbit right now, you can also go into the SCP practice problems. And so one of our practice problems is this problem or this phenomena involving our friend Marla. And Marla is a member of our city council, and she wants some changes to be made to make the city a little bit more bike friendly. And so if you're on InnerOrbit and you're working with our website, you can go into your account and you can click on the SCP practice problems here. I'm going to stop annotating so you can actually see what I'm doing. And click into the SCP practice problems. And from there, you can choose middle school. And what I did is chose asking questions and defining problems. And in this set of practice problems, we look at questions that are designed to assess students and get students to practice the SCP of asking questions and defining problems. And through that, we have a bunch of questions that get at different elements of that standard. And these are all the elements that are included within performance expectations. So one of the options that you have is to go in here and actually assign some of these questions, or we can just click preview assessment and we can ask students to, look at the data on the left-hand side and then look at the questions on the right-hand side and answer some of these questions to get them to practice just using the SCP. So one option is to do that. And if students do well on those questions, that's great. What we want to do are give them new opportunities now to apply that to different phenomena. And if you ever look at these practice problems on InnerOrbit, we have two different phenomena now for the SCP of asking questions and defining problems at the 6-8 grade level band. But let's say you ask students those questions and it's a struggle. So then you can go to the SCP practice problems and go back to elementary and go back to asking questions and defining problems at grade levels 3-5. And we can look at, different tools or different things that are helpful in, finding coins and jewelry in the sand. We can also, there's a second phenomena for this as well. And so you can go through and you can ask different questions to students that just focus on that SEP. And so this looks at, burdock hooks. These are just like the worst. I have never experienced these personally. Kate, have you ever ran into these? Quite literally, not good. Thankfully, we don't have these where we live. I'm sorry if that's a thing that y'all have to deal with. But those are fun. And we can ask students questions about asking questions and defining problems around those burdock plants, which are not cool. Okay, but let's just say they do well in those SCP practice problems and you want to give them additional practice. So on InnerOrbit, we can search for that standard MSPS23. And when we go through that search, there are going to be additional phenomena that you can pull from as well. And so we can look at how do doorbells ding dong, how's this junkyard getting cleaned up, how's this blob gobble stuff up, battery trains, buckets lighting up your life. Lots of different options for additional phenomena you can give students to say, all right, you struggle to make sense of this. Now, what do you notice? I wonder about this. Let me print this one out and give you options for that. And then you can give them an additional assessment that involves other electric and magnetic forces and ask them to make sense of that. All right, so now you've got some options for using InnerOrbit to do that. my colleague Kate is going to walk you through some different ways that we might scaffold up the process of not just like asking questions, but looking at a phenomena. And Kate's going to talk about that term one more time, some kind of like a thing that you think and you do frequently. And she's going to talk a little bit about how we might scaffold SEPs through a thinking routine. Kate, to you.
Thanks, Brendan. So Brendan's just given us a lot of really useful information. And I think what I would like to start with at this point is kind of asking a question. Yeah, I get it. So all of this information brings us to a really important question, which is why should we scaffold the science process? Like, if we're going to do this, we should probably have a why. And there's a really good answer for this, actually. All of you are educators, you know about the benefits of scaffolding. And one of those benefits is simply that it helps keep students in their zone of proximal development. And that's that brain space where like productive struggle results in learning becoming really like engaging or sticky. And I like to use the example here of like I knit. I have been knitting since I was a little kid. I can knit something simple and watch TV, right? I know how to do the stitches. I know the content. I don't need to look at it to do it. It's just muscle memory. But if I want to follow a really complex pattern, especially if there's a skill embedded in that pattern I don't know, I'm going to be in my zone of proximal development. I'm probably going to get frustrated. I'm probably going to have to rip it back like 3 or 4 times. I'm probably going to call my mom and be like, I don't know what's going on. So there's this zone of proximal development. But in the end, I'm going to result in having a new skill that I will be able to carry forward into other patterns and other things that I want to make. So that's where we want students to be. We know too that many students historically think of science as like a set of facts and words that they need to memorize and know and just regurgitate back to us. And this is a pretty straightforward and like low rigor approach to science. If you can get through your science classes that way, like for a lot of kids, that's like great, except that it's not very engaging. It's not very true to life, and it's not helping us understand the world around us. So what we need to help students do is decide what to do to approach these complex real world phenomena or problems, because they can be really elusive. And we don't spend a lot of time in our modern world thinking about them. So we need to support students with moving from what we know to what do I need to do with what I know to understand the world around me. So first, we need to find out what they can do without any support when they're not in their zone of proximal development. Can they sit and knit and watch TV at the same time? And this is where scaffolded questioning in a thinking routine can come into play. So if we help students successfully access and practice science practices, that always feels like Austin Powers. It's like too many babies, baby, right? Like if we can help them practice science practices, we can facilitate this transformation from students just like representing knowledge they've already been taught into this process of sense making, which is really truly bringing in what do I know, what do I have to do, and how do I need to look at it. We can do this by scaffolding the practice to help students solidify. I'm so glad Brendan likes this word so much, but like solidify a thinking routine that they can use again and again and again anytime they run into that like unproductive struggle and frustration. And we all know what our classrooms turn into. We have a bunch of students that are in that unproductive struggle. Like that is something we would like to avoid both for us and for them. So how do we help students bridge the gap between what they know and how they can just represent it back to us versus what they can do and get them a little bit into like, I maybe can't do this yet by myself, but I feel like I'm making progress and like I'm going to learn something and figure out something about the world. So let's dig a little deeper. So we're going to dig in back into this MSPS 2-3 performance expectation or standard, which asks students to ask questions about data. So we're asking questions about data to determine the factors that affect the strength of electric and magnetic forces. And again, we're looking at this phenomena of how do doorbells ding dong, and we're talking about like old school mechanical doorbells here. So to approach proficiency on this standard, let's evaluate that first. First, students need to know DCI facts and ideas about objects interacting at distances by electric and magnetic fields. They have to do this SEP of asking questions, and specifically of asking questions about data. And also remember, we need a purpose. So we hope that they're asking questions about data to like maybe design an investigation or do something, right? They need a purpose or just to figure out this phenomena, maybe. Like maybe that's all we're trying to do in our classroom right now. And they must look at this phenomena through the lens of like the CCC, which in this case is cause and effect. And again, we're sort of ignoring that here, but it's going to naturally come in to play as we talk a little bit more about this. So, all right, let's take all those things, sort of smash them together in our brain, which is not what kids inherently do right away, and keep doorbells in the back of our mind. And let's go back to those progressions for just a minute. So, according to the NGSS, students, regardless of grade level, have to do some semblance of the following things. So, first, they need to exercise curiosity about the world around them. In our science classrooms, we hope that that's happening every day. I know sometimes it doesn't. I know sometimes it's really obvious that it's not happening, but that's where we need them to start. You can't ask a good question if you're not curious. I love what some of the folks said in the chat when we first came in is like, I try to choose topics that are relevant to my students, right? What a great way that you all are already starting to spark this curiosity as educators. So we all know that we need to do this, but we also need to be able to determine, and Brendan mentioned this earlier, like the relevance of a question, or like what the criteria are for success when we think about defining an engineering problem. Like for us to even ask a question, we have to have some idea of like where we're going. I know from doing driving question boards in my classroom, students have a lot of questions, and being able to determine whether or not those questions are actually going to help us figure out the phenomena or define the engineering problem is a really, really important skill. And sometimes we gloss right over it. And then lastly, again, we need that driving, that purpose, right? And that's making sense of a phenomena so that we can begin to solve problems. Again, that purpose, right? This SEP is asking questions, but we're asking questions so that we can later engage in these other science and engineering practices like analyzing and interpreting data. You can see that come up in this standard, or like designing investigations. But for students who don't have experience with this or thinking routines for SEPs, this can be like challenging at best and unproductive struggle at worst. And for many of our students, in my opinion, and that's why we're coming to you with a resource like this, there's a fundamental step that's not defined here, that's missing. So let's dig into that a little bit. So a lot of us know how to scaffold our DCI content, but how do you scaffold a practice? And that is something that we have been thinking a lot about. And by going back into the grade level articulations, by going into Appendix F and like spending way more time than I ever want to spend in an appendix, with the collaboration of Brendan, a lot of other brilliant people at our company, we have narrowed this practice down into 4 categories to help students develop the thinking routine. And while the language of this is for y'all today, it's not for kids. And while I know some of you are going to have those little bells going off in your head of like, gosh, I would reword this for my students. Yes. Please reword this for your students, because we're thinking right now with like our teacher hats on, but we also want to take this scaffold and make it accessible to our students. So we're going to start at like kind of on the low end of rigor. And this is a step that I feel like is often missing when we read through the appendices and we read through how do we get students to ask good questions. The first step is like that curiosity, and like not just using it to ask a question, but using it to like, what information, what's here? What do I observe? What do I notice? What am I told? So these are not like, these are just noticings, right? This is not like a right or a wrong. These are just noticings. And we really want to ensure that students are given the opportunity to like be asked the question, just like, what do you notice about this phenomena? I'm thinking about the GIF of the doorbell, and we'll get back there when we go through examples. If we're thinking about not scientific questions necessarily, but engineering problems, we might phrase that question a little differently of like, what's the problem? Like, what is the problem that needs to be solved here? We're not asking our students to ask questions yet. We're just asking them to dig in a little bit with that curiosity. What do you notice? And then if we want to hone that in a little bit further, especially for some of our older students, what information have you been given that seems really important? So again, we're not asking questions yet, but like, what's here? What do you notice? And what do you think is important? Okay, so now we're going to go into wonderings. And for wonderings, students are leveraging their noticings. So we want to pull them to the next level. These aren't just like, okay, we did our noticings, now we're going to do wonderings, and they're totally different. We're pulling them along with us. And we're going to start formulating questions. So some questions that we can ask them, some guiding questions that we as teachers can use to bring students to this next step is, What do these noticings make you wonder about the phenomena or the problem? This is not rocket science, right? Like Kate has not come up with a magical recipe for getting kids to ask great scientific questions, right? But we are looking at a thinking routine that kids can use and guiding questions that we can use to pull them along with us. So, okay, let's say we're doing a driving question board and kids spit out all of those wonderings based on all of their noticings. Okay, now we know we need to refine at least a little bit. So, which of these wonderings are helpful or useful for either figuring out the phenomena or asking some good questions or solving the problem? Again, we're starting to cue that thought about our purpose. What is going to be our purpose in the end of this? There's a step in between just going from these wonderings to a really good scientific question. And I think part of that comes in with like evidence. Again, if we remember the wording of this performance expectation, it's ask questions about data. So we asked kids earlier, what information have you been given that seems really important? Now there's another important part of that is what information do you still need to know? This might guide our whole investigation. This might guide our whole process of solving the problem. What else do we need to know? And we're not like putting it in the question yet. We're just defining it, maybe listing it out. If we're not asking a scientific question, but we're defining an engineering problem, we might ask instead, what are the criteria for a successful solution? Like, what does success look like? And what are some possible limitations or trade-offs? So what are some things that could get us or keep us from getting to success or to done, right? And this is something that I know we all think about in our jobs every day. What are those blockers, right? What are those things that keep us from getting to done? If we are asking a question or proposing a solution to an engineering problem, but we already know that there's a huge blocker in the way, that is something to be considered and something we want students to be thinking about. And lastly, getting to our purpose of making sense of a phenomena or defining an engineering problem. And again, remember, we're not answering the question yet. We're not solving the problem yet. But it is really important for students to start honing those wonderings into effective, relevant scientific questions. And we can give them a couple of things to think about, like how can you clarify your questions to do the following things, like address your wondering. Like if you're going to ask a question about the world, you probably want to know the answer. Or provide any of that new evidence or information that you are going to need to have a good experiment or to come up with a good solution. How could it help you design an experiment or investigation to test a hypothesis that you have? Or how could your question, in this case, especially because we're thinking about data, help you figure out a relationship between variables, right? Remember, the CCC is cause and effect here. So that's something to tuck away. If we're working with engineering problems, we could ask instead, what are some possible solutions that could be tested, right? That might help us define the problem. If we can think about a hammer will fix this problem, that helps us actually define the problem. The designer model could be improved. So if we're evaluating an existing designer model to improve it or revise it, that's something we need to think about. And again, lastly, to get at that purpose, what are those limitations and trade-offs that might affect the solutions that we're considering or that we're evaluating? Okay, that's a lot. So let's look at how this actually might look in a classroom. And again, this thinking routine can be done over the course of maybe just like sitting in one class and having discourse with your students over a single phenomena, like how do doorbells ding dong? Or it might happen across an entire unit where we're building towards getting better at this practice of asking questions and defining engineering problems. So in this phenomena, we are given a GIF, and it looks like a battery and a magnet and a spinning copper coil. Like, this doesn't look like a doorbell. That's really interesting, but okay. So we're given some information that this is a machine that helps us understand how like these OG doorbells work. And students have been studying electric and magnetic forces in class, and they decide that they're going to design a doorbell where a nail slides through a copper coil and it strikes a bell that then rings. And they gather some data about their experimental setup. Well, we need students to ask questions about this, relevant questions that could help us analyze data to determine cause and effect relationships. That's the performance expectation. So with that in mind, let's look at that series of scaffolded guiding questions again, and let's look at some examples of how this could play out for us in our classroom. So we're going to stick with just asking questions. I've kind of gotten rid of those pink questions that deal with engineering problems, defining engineering problems. We're just going to talk about asking questions right now. So remember, our first part of our thinking routine is observations. What do you notice about the phenomena? And some things that we might expect students to say in this case are included, but are definitely not limited to, like, oh, the copper wire spins when there's a battery and a magnet. That is something that like I can observe. The students tested 3 different batteries, but they didn't record their data. Like if we go back and we look at the picture, there's like a picture and it shows like a small battery, a big battery, and a little battery. And it tells them in the phenomena that they tested 3 different batteries, but like there's no data about that. That's interesting observation. And then the student's doorbell actually looks different than the spinning copper. Like it's a nail going through like a copper coil, but it's not like spinning, I don't think. That's an interesting observation. So let's look at what it might look like when we take that and we pull those noticings and observations into some wonderings, which are like, does the nail slide through the copper? And does it slide through the copper for the same reason that the copper in the gift spins? Or is this like a totally different force at work? Does the size of the battery, because like I had a noticing about a battery, so like does the size of the battery even matter? Like, does it impact the loudness of the doorbell? Because I noticed that loudness was something they measured, but they didn't measure it when they and compare it to the like size of the battery. So does that matter? I have some wonderings, and I'm sure there's a lot of other wonderings that students would come up with about this. So for evidence, like what else do we need to know? What additional information would help us make sense of this? Well, like, does the wire need both the battery and a magnet? Like if the students didn't test the different size batteries, like do they even need the battery or do they just need the battery and not the magnet? Like do both of these things have to be here for this copper to spin or for the doorbell to work? And then, okay, now we're going to clarify, like let's start honing our question to something that we can actually like test, which there's a couple here. And I think that's cool because having students do different investigations eventually, again, different SEP, but that's our purpose, is to get us to different SEPs. Do doorbells require both electric forces and magnetic forces in order to function? So I've pulled in a little bit of my DCI language and like, I want to know, do I need both a battery and a magnet for this doorbell to work? Or could I get by with just a battery, maybe? And then when thinking about cause and effect, right, I would be guiding my students towards that CCC, even though we're not talking about it much here. How does the size of the battery affect the loudness of the doorbell? Testable question in the classroom could help them gather data that they can collect to answer a question and make sense of a phenomena. Okay, so what have we done to help move students toward success on this SEP and towards sense making by scaffolding it? Well, here's the first thing that we did. We generated a set of questions that students can use again and again as a thinking routine. There's Brendan's favorite word again, to ask questions regardless of the content that they are engaged in. So the DCI content here doesn't matter. Anytime students are asked to generate good scientific questions, they can use this thinking routine. Sometimes what's more important is what we didn't do. And we didn't ask students to immediately connect what they know to what they have to do without building this skill. Remember, we need skills and we need a purpose to get to sense making. If we don't help them build the skill, but we know they're not being successful at it, we're never going to get to sense making. And we're going to spend a lot of time in unproductive struggle or in just checking out because we're not interested anymore, right? So this is a really important thing that we didn't do. We did scaffold students thinking about the SEP. In other words, we scaffolded the what they need to do, not just the what they need to know, but scaffolding what they need to do will help them apply their knowledge in the future. We didn't require that students make sense of this phenomena or solve a complex engineering problem or even like define it all at once. We didn't just go right to like, what is the problem? Or what is a testable scientific question that we can use to figure out how a doorbell works? Like that would have shut me down. It still might shut me down as a learner, right? I need some steps or a thinking routine to get there. Lastly, we've created a format in which students can be partially successful, even if they don't fully create a testable scientific question, completely identify an engineering problem, or we're not even getting to purpose, which would be like analyzing and interpreting data to answer the question or designing an experiment. We know how important partial success, partial proficiency, growth, and movement towards proficiency is. And these scaffolds are one way to provide that for our students. And lastly, what we did not do is place students in this all or nothing situation, right? We didn't just say, ask a question that will help you analyze data, right, to determine the cause and effect relationship between two variables. That's a lot. That's a lot for a middle schooler. Okay, by doing and not doing those things, here's what we've done in terms of working on the performance expectation. We have scaffolded what students need to do so they can apply what they know to make sense of novel phenomena, hitting on the SEP. We have prompted students to leverage their knowledge of two of the three important parts of this standard. And we've hit on the DCI by mistake, almost. They've had to incorporate what they know to come up with that good question or define that problem by the end. And lastly, all students can completely or partially answer the question, how do doorbells ding dong, by the end of this, right? Even though that's not the goal, is to like answer that question, they should be able to, based on their understanding of the SEP through the thinking routine and applying their DCI knowledge to that. With that, I'm passing it back over to Brendan.
Well, thank you all very much for being here. We are grateful for your time and for your consideration. That is the end of the webinar. If you would like to schedule time to meet with us to chat about these things, or if you have any feedback for Kate or for me on this session, we would love, love, love to hear it. You can click on the link in the chat or in the description to make a meeting with us. But otherwise, thank you all so much for being here.